Hey folks, I'm Alex Dowd.
And I'm Katie Rife.
On today's episode, we're discussing the new dramas from two like-minded frequent collaborators. The first is The Nest, directed by Sean Durkin and starring Jude and Carrie Coon. And the second is The Devil All the Time, directed by Antonio Campos and starring a whole Hollywood ensemble of famous actors.
Welcome to Film Club.
Okay, Katie, so this week on the show, we are going to be talking about a couple of new movies. Both of them came out last week. One of them in theaters and the other one on Netflix. And, we pair movies all the time on this show. We don't necessarily need a reason to pair, say, the King of Staten Island and whatever we paired that with when we did that episode. If there are two new movies out.
Yeah, Bloodshot in the Way Back. That was an interesting
Right, exactly. We don't really. If they're new movies and they're out and people can watch them, here they are. Here's your nonsensical double feature. But this week we actually do have a reason to pair the two films. They actually would make an appropriate double feature, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the two filmmakers, and that is Sean Durkin and Antonio Campos, are actually frequent collaborators. They're two of the co-founders of Borderline Films. It's a New York-based production company that started about 15 years ago or so. We actually did a whole series last week because these films were both coming out in the same week. We did a whole series on Borderline Films through the AV Club's Watch This feature. So if you're curious about the production company and about the kind of films that they make, we wrote about 5 of them last week and recommended them.
Yeah, I did one of those entries about The Eyes of My Mother, which is a horror film that you and I both really like, Alex. And while I was doing research for that, I found a page for MoMA did a Borderline Films night back in 2016, around the time Eyes of My Mother came out. And their description of the Borderline sort of signature house style I thought was really concise and, evocative. It was a good description. They said they were known for striking visual style and harrowing emotional intensity.
Yeah, that's pretty right on, I'd say.
Yeah.
I think the company kind of, they've made a couple horror films. I think that The Eyes of My Mother is a straight horror film. Most of their films, though, released under the Borderline umbrella, one might say, are dramas that kind of have the persistent mood of dread you might associate with a horror movie.
Right, yeah. And The Eyes of My Mother, the pure horror release, was Borderline Presents. It was sort of a sidebar, like a Miramax in Dimension, I guess.
Totally, yep. I sort of get the impression that these filmmakers, this entire group of filmmakers, are big fans of, like, Roman Polanski's Repulsion or something, because a lot of them operate in this kind of state of psychological distress. These films kind of privilege atmosphere and mood, and again, I think they all have the kind of general unease you might associate with a horror film. Durkin started his career with Martha Marcy May Marlene. That was his first feature, and The Nest, which again opened in theaters last week and will be available to watch at home within the next few weeks. I believe mid-October or something is when they're releasing it at home if you don't want to go to a movie theater. And The Nest is his first feature since Martha Marcy. It's been 11 years. Campos,
wow, it's been that long?
Yeah, It's been 11 years. He made a TV show called Southcliffe, I believe. And I never saw that, but this is his second feature. Very belated. Campos, on the other hand, has been working. Antonio Campos, who made the other film we're discussing today, The Devil All the Time, he started his career with After School, one of the first films in the Borderline canon, and after that made Simon Killer and Christine. So he's been a little bit more productive. I do think that these two filmmakers share some sensibilities. Certainly, and I just think it's really interesting that I have to assume it's actually kind of a coincidence that these two films are opening. That these two films came out within 2 days of each other, because I don't think either of them are actually Borderline films. I think both of them are just these filmmakers are just refugees from that movement, one might say.
Exactly. I was going to make a sort of any port in a storm kind of metaphor talking about the current theatrical state of exhibition.
Yeah. It's just interesting that these would I mean, by presumed coincidence, open right around each other. I wonder if the two of them have had phone calls this week, sort of congratulating each other. It's too bad they're not like in normal times. These two might both be in theaters, and they'd be able to like compete for whose movie is going to make more money this week.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the Devil All the Time is a Netflix release. And so one assumes that Netflix, I don't have any inside information about this, but considering a lot of their stuff, just goes straight on the platform regardless, I would assume that one didn't experience the same kind of upheaval the way that The Nest might have as a theatrical release.
Yeah. I see what you're saying. I actually do think that The Devil All the Time is playing in a few theaters at this point, but it's also available on Netflix, which means that you can safely watch it at home.
Yeah, that's a whole phenomenon that I think we've discussed a few times on the podcast about how Netflix used to be really militant about day and date releases and have this adversarial relationship with movie theaters, and then they decided they want to start winning awards, and now they're a little more cooperative.
Yeah. It's interesting though. I mean, I do feel like we're during a time right now where it's hard to imagine any filmmaker objecting too much to their film not getting a theatrical release at the current moment. And even the Academy, I mean, one reason that Netflix got into the game of bringing things to theaters first is that the Academy had these strict rules about how something could not play in a home video capacity before theaters. If it did, it would not be eligible for awards. But as far as I know, the Academy is bending that rule this year for obvious reasons.
Yeah, they're going to have to bend it this year if they want to have, unless they want to give Oscars to Bad Boys for Life, they could.
Yeah, or Sonic the Hedgehog or something.
Yeah, whatever was out in February.
Yeah.
Birds of Prey.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so let's start by talking about The Nest.
Okay.
And that, again, is Durkin's first film since Martha Marcy May Marlene, which, by the way, I don't know how you feel about that film. I love Martha Marcy May Marlene.
I love that film. That was the first film I ever saw Elizabeth Olsen in, and I was just like, wow. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's her screen debut, if I'm not mistaken.
It might have been. It was definitely... I definitely remember sort of the media line at the time being like, the Olsen twins have a sister, and she's a serious actress.
Well, she's remarkable in it. I mean, she's remarkable.
Yeah.
In that film. We could do an episode on that film, which I think is really smart about the relationship between the past and the present, and really smart about the process of deprogramming. Because she plays a young woman who is basically has escaped a cult and is in the process of potentially deprogramming, and I really love that film.
And has to kind of deal with the sort of familial fallout of being in a cult, which necessarily cuts you off from your family, but they take her back in, and there's a lot of complicated, messy emotions.
For sure. So The Nest, I mean, there is an element of thriller to Martha Marcy May Marlene. It is like a lot of the borderline films. I think it kind of toes the line between drama and thriller. At least very much in tone. The Nest is ostensibly is just a drama. I mean, there's no overt element of danger or menace in it, but you would not necessarily know that just starting the film, because the atmosphere of this thing is exactly like that of a horror movie.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is there is the dread that hangs over it. They never give it a name, or even they don't identify it specifically. One of the characters, I think at some point, says something about how everything has gone wrong since we moved to this house, but they never are like, it's a supernatural force that's doing this to them, like The Shining, or, The Turn of the Screw or something like that. They never say that outright, but there definitely is a heavy atmosphere that hangs over the film. And the cinematography is also very sort of shrouded. It's very gray.
Oh, yeah. Well, and the way Durkin directs it, he directs it like a horror movie. I mean, a lot of it is set in this giant estate. I mean, basically, almost really a castle. In Surrey, England. The plot basically concerns Jude Law plays Rory. He's a commodities broker originally from London, who had years earlier moved to America, chasing financial dreams. He has started an American family. his wife Allison, played by Carrie Coon, and she has a teenage daughter, and the two of them now have a 10-year-old son, basically. And they've been living in the film is set in the 1980s, and they've been living in America, and he's been kind of chasing the kind of the Wall Street dream, one might say. I mean, this is very much a film. I mean, I think it's very specifically set in the 80s because of that sort of Reagan era idea of chasing prosperity.
And the greed is good mentality definitely informs the character.
Very much so. You could see, I mean, Rory would be a disciple of Gordon Gekko.
Absolutely, he would, yes.
So at the beginning of the film, though, we kind of learn that the law character Rory has moved his family around a little bit, always kind of chasing this next big score. And his latest idea is we're going to move back to England. And we're going to move near London, and I'm going to take my old job back at this company, and we're going to be truly prosperous. And so they move back to this giant estate in Surrey, outside of London. Honestly, you could watch this film, and if you knew nothing about this going into this film, they show up at this house, and Durkin films it in these kind of long, ominous wide shots, sort of lingering on hallways. The editing is even sometimes it holds a beat too long, and sometimes he'll do this hard cut out of a conversation that's very unsettling. He directs it like a horror movie, honestly. And so I think if you went into this thing blind, you might spend a lot of the first hour wondering, man, they really are taking a long time for the ghost to show up here, you know?
Yeah, you'd be waiting for that scene where they'd all be asleep, and then there'd be a loud noise, a loud banging noise.
Well, there's even like a kind of a, I don't even know if it's designed as a fake out, but it kind of operates as one. There's a scene where Carrie Coon's character Allison, where she can't figure out why a door in the house is open, and again, it's is this the moment when this becomes a horror movie? And spoiler, it's not. But the whole film definitely has the atmosphere of a horror film.
And I think that's the same scene that had the line I cited where she said everything's been going wrong since we came to this house. And she kind of implies that there's something wrong with the house.
Yep. Well, I mean, I think the house becomes this... Really what the house is it's this giant symbol for this character's... for his kind of fake it until you make it bullshit strategy of getting rich. I mean, the movie is...
Except he's not making it the way
he's not. I mean, the movie is all about somebody who's kind of enslaving his family to his aspirations of prosperity. You know?
Yeah, and lying, and there's a lot of dishonesty with that character, and it's not just faking it till you make it. It's the ends justify the means, also.
Very much so, yeah. The house is just this giant, grotesque symbol of how much he is living a life that he cannot really afford. You know, like he has moved. It's like he found the biggest, most expensive property to move them into, even though there's nothing behind. He does not have the money for it, and he's kind of banking on a series of sort of get rich quick schemes, basically.
Yeah, well, he's kind of banking on just swanning into it's his mentor is the one who's brought him back to England, and he's kind of counting on swanning in, and everyone going, oh, well, you've got the wisdom of Wall Street, do whatever you want. And then he's frustrated when it turns out that, basically he seems to have this idea of how everything's going to go that doesn't have any connection to reality at all. And I suppose there is a sort of madness or delusion in there.
Oh, I don't think you need to qualify that. I mean, I think it's a form of extreme delusion on his part, and I think Law plays that so perfectly. I mean, I've always liked him as an actor. I felt for a few years that when he got famous, I felt that a lot that people looked at him and all they could really see is just how damn handsome he is.
Right.
And he's a very handsome man, and he remains handsome, I think. In middle age at this point, but a lot of filmmakers I don't think knew exactly what to do with him. But I think the best application of Jude Law's talents as an actor, I think, is when he's playing somebody who projects, either successfully or not, but who at least attempts to project this notion of success, basically. But there's this desperation that nips around the edges of it,
and that's kind of playing on his star image, like you were saying, because when he first became became famous, it was basically just like, wow, he's so handsome and he's such a great actor, and that's a facade in itself, you know?
Oh, for sure, for sure. I would put this particular performance of his, in terms of finding the exact right application of his talents and that star persona you're talking about. I would put this up there with Dickie Greenleaf in The Talented Mr. Ripley, but also in a much different register, obviously, with the character he plays in I Heart Huckabees, who actually is very similar in some ways. You know, like in Huckabees, he plays that character who is always telling this same story. He has this same celebrity anecdote, and he just keeps recycling it. And that, like, him as kind of this slick bullshit artist. I think he's very, very good at that. And yeah, I mean, I think this is like kind of a magnificently pathetic performance.
Well, bringing it around, you know, to the horror movie thing you were talking about, there is the sort of your element where you're waiting for the ghost. But I name checked The Shining, and there's a sort of something to be played with there about like this like megalomaniacal man moves his family to a place where they don't know anyone, this gigantic house that they can't fill, and like you know, and again, Durkin doesn't push it to the point of like even close to where The Shining goes, you know, where, I guess, spoiler alert, if you don't know what happens in The Shining 40 years later, he becomes a homicidal maniac. He never pushes it that far. But there's little moments in this movie whenever someone tells Jude Law's character something he doesn't want to hear. There's this little flash of like entitlement and anger in him, and just the way he responds to being told no, that I felt like sort of it's maybe a little bit of a nod to the character of the crazy dad.
Yeah. No, I think it's very astute to note that this is basically The Shining without the ghosts, you know? Like, what if they just moved into that house and were miserable, you know?
And there's all kinds of lies that are being told, and, you know, and in the name of being this certain type of father that he thinks he needs to be, he's kind of leading his family over the cliff.
Very much so. I think Carrie Coon is pretty remarkable in this film too, to be honest.
Oh yeah, very much.
You know, she's Carrie Coon has built a reputation for great television work. I think, you know, she was on The Leftovers and also on the TV adaptation of Fargo. So she is kind of at this point, I think she's considered kind of a major actor on the small screen, but has not necessarily gotten as many great roles on the big screen. And I think
that's true.
You know, this kind of resolves that, though, I think, because this is a really great role, and she gets some really show-stopping moments. I mean, she's playing this woman who is basically kind of waking up to how much her husband is full of shit.
Right.
And she's so good and believably tough in the role that at times I did find myself wondering how she put up with Rory as long as she did. Like, what we see of Coon's character in this movie is so no nonsense, you know, that you wonder, like, how did she get this many years into this marriage without ditching this guy, you know?
Maybe the facade is only recent. Maybe the shine's starting to come off, you know? Maybe his whole bullshit act has worked so far, or at least she's never had to sort of face the bullshit, you know, like maybe the money's been coming in this whole time, and so she's not particularly motivated to lift up the mask and see what's underneath it. Yeah. But now that everything's kind of falling apart, she's realizing that, you know, she doesn't actually know the man she's married to, which is also a horror movie plot.
Yep. Yeah. And I think there is the implication too that she enjoys the luxuries that maybe even just his fake prosperity has bought her at this point. I mean, she is somebody who she dresses glamorously, you know. She has a horse that she loves, which by the way, I think one of the movie's weaknesses is that this horse becomes this giant metaphor. I like the house better as a metaphor than the horse.
The horse
gets a little on the nose, I think, at a certain point.
But there is a disturbing moment of, I guess, body horror, I guess you could call it, involving the horse that I found pretty unsettling. Yeah,
that's Durkin for you, you know.
For sure, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I loved her scene in the restaurant. There's a scene where she kind of flips she kind of flips the way that men of means often talk about often order for their wife, for example, in a restaurant, and she kind of flips that for her own amusement. And the way she smokes in this movie is so, she like that cigarette is like, it's like some comedians will use a cigarette as like punctuation for their jokes or something. She uses that as punctuations for like a slam, basically,
Yeah, it's very aggressive smoking.
Yeah. I guess where I land with this one is that I don't think it's, as a piece of storytelling, I don't think it's anything too remarkable. I think we've seen plenty of dramas of this sort about people who are kind of chasing means that they don't possess, and dragging their families through their class aspirations. But Durkin just directs the living hell out of it.
Yeah, I agree. I feel that because when I first started the film, I didn't really read much about this film before I watched it, but I knew it wasn't a full-on horror movie. So I was watching it kind of being like, oh, geez, another movie about the difficulties of being wealthy, which it's a pretty tired, type of storytelling, I think, just simply because there's so much of it. But by the end of it, I felt that the mood and the performances really brought me on board.
Yeah, there's this scene that I think kind of demonstrates just how much he's doing with this material, and it's a scene where Rory is being, it's like the welcome back party for him, basically, and he's dragged Alice into the party, and it's just one of these like soul deadening parties where everyone is speaking in these empty platitudes and pleasantries.
Yeah.
And they're at the moment where the boss is basically sort of singing Rory's praises and welcoming him back. But the scene but Durkin just sort of locks onto Carrie Coon's face, and just sort of recognizes in her performance that she can tell us something that the rest of the scene isn't necessarily telling us, which is this slow realization that's happening to her, where she is coming to terms with just how empty all of this is, and how much her husband just lives for the kind of ceremony that is being bestowed upon him in that moment.
Yeah, and she fully moved to another country under false pretenses with her children.
Yep.
It's interesting because there was a little small moment in this movie that I really latched onto as well, but it's a different one that features Jude Law. And there's a scene where it's starting to become obvious that he is not pulling in the type of money that he says he is, and this is all pretty much doomed to fail, this entire experiment. And so he asks her for money, to borrow some money. Oh, until my check comes in. And she has a little stash of cash she's hidden somewhere in their bedroom. And she says to him, I want you to leave the room, because she doesn't trust him. She doesn't want him to see where the money is hidden. And he goes, really? And she goes, yeah. And he walks out of the room and he stands in the hallway, and just the look of anger on his face, I think, really showed the character's folly, I think.
Yeah, I mean, Durkin is really well attuned, I think, to the psychological pivots in this film and in this story. I think to him, that's kind of the whole draw of this material, if I had to guess. Okay, so let's talk about the other film out last week from one of these Borderline Films guys, and that would be Antonio Campos's The Devil All the Time. And that's on Netflix, and I think that has been, because of its availability on Netflix, I think that has been a little bit more of a talking point, at least online.
There's been more discussion of it because of its availability, like you said.
Side note, though, this is the conspiracy theorist in me, but I do feel like when Netflix has a new film, sometimes you'll see all these accounts will pop up that are suddenly like trying to memeify one of their movies. It'll be like one like, can you believe that look on someone's face? And it'll just be like a still from the movie, and I'm like, did Netflix create all these accounts to promote this movie?
Do you click through to the bio? The bio could say they work in the Netflix social team. You know what I mean?
That's true, yeah. But sometimes they don't, but they don't have a lot of followers. And I'm like, oh, you just had to log on to rave about this movie that's been on there for like 5 hours,
These companies do have very large social teams, so.
Yeah, that's true. So what did you think of this one? Can I ask you that?
This one I thought was a little ridiculous. It kind of brought me what I was promised by Twitter, which was just really harebrained, trashy, pulpy, Southern Gothic horse shit, basically. And that's a genre of film unto itself, Southern Gothic pseudo-noir thriller, and that's what this movie is reaching for. But I felt that it didn't really understand its setting, it didn't really understand its characters, and its themes were applied in such a heavy-handed way that the more straight-faced and intense it got, because this movie has a lot of murder in it and sex and just a lot of lurid content, the more lurid it got, the goofier I felt it was. And so I did get a little bit of a chuckle out of it, especially since it is set in basically eastern Ohio, the Appalachian part of Ohio by the West Virginia border, which is, where I lived for a while. And I'm from Ohio originally. So I did get a little bit of a chuckle because usually these, I guess you could call them the sort of like poor man's Killer Joe. I feel like all these movies kind of riff off of Killer Joe. But Killer Joe was set in Texas, like a lot of these movies are, so it was kind of fun to have an Ohio version of it for me personally.
Midwest Gothic, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Oh, I would argue Appalachia is a distinct cultural region, but
for sure.
Appalachian noir, I would say.
Well, but here's the thing, though, and you could speak to this more than I can, but I think you could watch this thing, and the fact that it's set in Ohio ultimately feels
arbitrary as hell.
Rather arbitrary. I mean, honestly, if you told me this movie was set in the South, I'd believe you. In the deep South, because I think that its conception of this world is very much steeped in Southern Gothic cliche, one might say.
Yes, very much so. So the basic plot of the film is it's an intergenerational family story following, we start with a guy, his name is Willard Russell, he's played by Bill Skarsgård, and it starts with a really pulpy scene of him witnessing war atrocities in World War II, and kind of goes from there and follows him and relatives of theirs in West Virginia, and it eventually comes together. Everybody's murdering each other. This is a very flippant description, but it's not inaccurate. So it is an intergenerational story, and you start with the kind of World War II generation, and just basically a lot of amoral, nihilistic violence happening, a lot of overbaked Southern accents, and a scene that I think is supposed to be a riff on snake handling, but it's a jar of spiders that a creature dumps on himself. So it's just a lot of murder and fire and brimstone. And then then you land on the next generation, which is two orphan kids played by Tom Holland and Eliza Scanlon from Little Women, and they were both orphaned because their fathers either killed their mothers or killed themselves. And so, they're kind of set up for violence, and I think it's supposed to be making some sort of comment on intergenerational violence, and also I thought it was a very atheistic movie because the title, The Devil All the Time, all the characters are very religious and are always praying to God, and some of them have really twisted ideas of what God approves of. And I got this kind of like God has forsaken you theme throughout the film that was... I felt this movie was a little bit of a unintentional parody of its genre.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a world where God's presence is not felt, even though all of the characters are obsessed with potential salvation and with their sins. I mean, the movie essentially opens with a crucifixion. That's one of the first things we see in the film. Exactly. Is Bill Skarsgård's character, Tom Holland's
that's
father
the
in the
war
film.
atrocity.
We see him during World War II, and he basically witnesses somebody who's been crucified, and that kind of sets the tone of this film, I think, in a lot of ways.
And it's not the last crucifixion in the film, actually.
It is not. You say that it's too ridiculous. ridiculous. I honestly felt that this thing could have stood to lean into its absurdity a little bit
Go
more.
a little further with it?
Yeah, I mean, and I think a lot of that has to do with Campos, honestly, who I think is a very accomplished director and a very controlled director. His previous films, again, are After School, Christine, and Simon Killer. And these are films that I think are very formally controlled, but they're also films that I think have a sort of maintain a certain icy distance from the material. And I don't know, to me that feels like a bit of a mismatch of director to material. I think this needed somebody like David McNaughton, director of Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer and Wild Things.
Yeah.
You need somebody who can really lean into the sleaze because
Feel the hellfire, right?
Yeah, oh yeah. Because, I mean, all the characters in this film are archetypes, and they're all played by mostly fabulous actors, mostly well-known actors. I mean, we get Riley Keough and Jason Clarke play a couple who are road tripping across the country, and they turn out to be serial killers.
It's a very... did you ever see the movie The Honeymoon Killers from the 60s? It's a lot like that. Or perhaps a Southern Fried Natural Born Killers.
Yeah. And that's like a subplot in the film.
Yes.
The serial killers are a subplot in this film. And,
top to bottom murder.
Yep. The Harry Mellon character that you mentioned, who's this, he's kind of this hysterical country preacher, turns out to be more than a few screws loose. You have Sebastian Stan as kind of a brutal small town cop. All the characters in this are archetypes, and I think the actors are doing their best to kind of breathe some life into them. But I honestly, watching this movie, and it's based on a book by Donald Ray Pollock, and watching it, I got the impression that the book either found more nuance in these characters, or it played it to the rafters a little bit more. Campos, to my eyes, is kind of hitting somewhere in the middle, where it's not like these characters are developing into these richly developed, to these richly nuanced people in front of our eyes. But they're also, most of the actors are not playing it as camp. So
that's true.
Kind of hits in this middle zone.
Well, what you said actually does speak to the other big impression I got with the film. I think the reason why it all came across as a little bit ridiculous to me, because I felt that the drama and especially the psychological motivations were kind of dramatically inert. And so when you do just leapfrog straight into like a very lurid concept, or like a scene of like a vicious murder in the context of this sort of inert drama, you're just kind of like, what? There was a lot of scoffing, I have to admit. When I was watching this movie, I was going, what? Like, a lot.
I honestly thought of something kind of like Babel almost, where this kind of belongs to the We Are All Connected school of ensemble drama.
But in a very nihilistic way, I feel like.
In an extremely nihilistic way.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe we are all connected through...
the devil.
Through sin and through the impossibility of the divine or something.
Perhaps.
I do think there's one framework you can put over it that to me made it a little bit more interesting, is if you think about this film as a movie about post-war America and about the way that war reshapes the character of a country. A lot of the dominoes, I think, are set off by characters who have fought in the war. I mean, the film starts in the 40s, right after World War II, basically, and it's established very early on that the Skarsgård character, again, is a veteran of the war. He's seen some shit over there, and I think there's almost this implication that he brings with him the sin and the trauma of the war back to America. And then the film is
evil of the war follows him,
kind of, and sort of reshapes the American landscape. Like we are seeing a post-war America, and I don't think it's an accident that the movie is bracketed on the other end by Vietnam, and you have characters thinking of enlisting at the end of that film. That to me is the most charitably interesting framework I think you could put over this. Because the film as a whole, I think it's just it just ends up playing like a daisy chain of like sort of ludicrously overcranked Southern Gothic violence and sex.
Yes. That is an interesting framework, and it's definitely more interesting than the sort of thematic through line that I saw in it, which is the best I could figure as to why the violence is so ludicrously overcranked, I think you said, is that I felt that maybe there was a kind of a counterpoint to fire and brimstone evangelical preaching, the type that is quite common in Appalachia, that often reaches a very hysterical pitch. And, you'll have sermons where basically the entire sermon is a preacher describing in like Clive Barker level detail all the tortures that'll happen to you in hell. Yeah. And I felt that maybe this was like an atheistic version of that, perhaps. But I think your way of looking at it is a little more interesting.
What did you think of the performances?
I thought they were, I don't want to say that they were bad, because they weren't all bad, but I just feel like the characters, like you said, they weren't taking it to the level where this could be delicious, where this could be camp.
Except there is one actor who
I think I hesitated.
Yeah, there's one actor who I think is treating this like juicy pulp. And that is Robert Pattinson.
And he just kind of parachutes in and out of the movie also.
He does. I mean, he plays another, this is a movie with multiple sort of sham country preachers. And he plays this kind of lecherous con artist of a local reverend. And with I think this movie's instant... I think it was smart of Netflix, to, I don't know. Actually, Netflix probably wasn't involved in this at all. Very quickly when this movie hit Netflix, a scene started making the rounds of Pattinson's accent. Let's hear that scene real quick.
The lies are hers. She's got it in her head that I was a father. But I was going to take care of everything. But God damn it, boy. Listen to me. I ain't gonna take the blame for no bastard child. It would ruin me, man. You can understand that, can't you?
So there you go. He's doing... It's a very exaggerated accent in some ways.
Exaggerated and inconsistent and confusing. I can't really speak to the accuracy of all of the accents. To me, they sounded more generic Southern than anything.
Yeah.
Than that, if you, to me, the Appalachian accent is, if you've ever heard a clip of Loretta Lynn talking, that's what an Appalachian accent sounds like.
Got it.
And my grandma talked like that. And the accents that people were doing in this movie didn't exactly fit that for me, except for Pattinson every once in a while. Every once in a while, he'd say a word, and I'd be like, that's it. But then he would just completely go somewhere else with it.
I just think he's the only actor in the movie that seems to recognize the movie that he's in. Maybe even more so than the filmmaker,
Perhaps so, yeah.
He just kind of keys into the potential for camp in this material. Maybe I'm giving him too much credit. Maybe it's just a bad performance. But I felt in general that...
I don't know.
I enjoyed watching him in a way that I didn't enjoy watching everybody else in this film.
Yes, he's what I wanted out of this movie.
Yes. So you can at least speak to you can maybe speak a little bit to the environmental accuracy of this film. Yeah.
So, it was accurate enough. It was wooded and hilly. But there was a movie that came out last year that actually wasn't that great of a movie, despite the presence of Olivia Colman and Walton Goggins in it. It was just okay. But it's on Hulu now. It was called Them That Follow, and it was a snake handling drama that I felt that film caught the atmosphere and the geography beautifully. But yeah, like I said, this movie it's on the right map, but it's not in the right zip code, I guess is how I would put it.
Okay.
And there was one thing up top that this is something that you wouldn't notice unless you had lived around there, but up top of the movie I kind of went, oh, okay. They don't really know what they're talking about here. They say that it takes 10 hours to drive from a town on the border of West Virginia and Ohio to a town in South Central Ohio. They say it takes 10 hours to drive there in 1957. And I almost paused the movie and thought about it, where I was like, no, that'd be a horse and buggy, because even it's 90 miles from the two places that they're talking about. It's 90 miles away. It's 3 hours on a backcountry mountain road. And so that to me was just really indicative of the sort of carelessness of this film when it came to world building.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know what I say, which is that if a movie is really working for you, you forgive plot holes, you forgive logical inconsistencies. Exactly. You forgive these things because the movie's otherwise working. If a movie's not working for you, you tend to fixate on these nitpicky things. So, I don't know. Maybe that says something about your reaction.
I definitely fixated on that one. I was just like, guys. Because, well, and I think you're right that if the movie had been great overall, I wouldn't even have remembered it. But something like that is just, to me, indicative of something that I don't understand, how you could get to the point of adapting a screenplay and going through multiple drafts and citing specific numbers and not think to even, like, you can pull up Google Maps and like the town in the film has an absolutely ridiculous name. It is Knockemstiff, Ohio, but that is a real place. And you can look up, you know, like that, go on Google Maps and look up that town to the other town you cited and see what it says. And it's not, 10 hours is a West Texas kind of time frame. It's not an Appalachia time frame. Yeah. So, which, you know, really, it just drove home the sort of like poor man's Killer Joe aspect of this film to me. That's all we've got for you this week. You can watch The Devil All the Time on Netflix now, and The Nest is currently playing in theaters, but will be on demand on November 17th. In the meantime, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to Film Club wherever you get your podcasts.
This week's episode of Film Club was hosted by me, Alex Dowd, and by Katie Rife. It was produced and edited by Carl Blumberg. Our sound mixer and finishing editor is Seth Hafer, and our motion graphics designer is Julie Mullins. We'll be back next week with a brand new episode. Thanks.
Thanks.